Hello, this is UCL Uncovering Politics, and today we're going for the big one. How should we think about the basic principles that should govern our society? Hello, my name is Alan Rennick, and welcome to UCL Uncovering Politics, the podcast of the School of Public Policy and Department of Political Science at University College London. Politics is the process by which we make collective choices, by which we decide how generous the welfare state will be, what kind of education system we will operate, what crimes will be punishable with what penalties, and so on. But what are the basic principles that should guide us in making such choices? How should a society go about making its collective decisions? This is perhaps the most fundamental question in politics, and it's a question that is addressed in a magisterial new book published earlier this year by our colleague here in the UCL Department of Political Science, Professor Albert Weale. The book is called Modern Social Contract Theory, and across over 400 pages, it traces the development of and variants in what has become the dominant approach in contemporary political theory to answering the question of how to make collective decisions. And that approach, the clue is in the title, is called social contract theory. Well, Albert joins me now to discuss what social contract theory is, what it implies for collective decision-making, and how the theory continues to develop today. Albert, welcome to UCL Uncovering Politics.
Alan, thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you very much for that kind introduction.
Let's start with the basic question then. What is social contract theory?
So, as you were saying in the introduction, politics confronts us with some large questions. What is the role of the state in deciding on the distribution of income? How and why are citizens obliged to follow collective decisions? How should a state conduct itself in its international affairs? And social contract theory gives us a way of trying to answer those questions. It provides us, if you like, with a method. And the core idea of the method is really quite a simple one, I think, which is that the principles that should appeal to us when we consider these big questions are those that we would agree, were we making a social contract with other people in our society to determine the principles of our association together. In other words, we have to imagine ourselves forming the constitution of a society and asking ourselves at that formative moment, by what principles do we want our political association to be governed, to be run? Now, that basic idea is in fact a very old one. It goes back to classical Athens. It goes back to the sophists of classical Athens. And in fact, in Plato's Republic, it's reported as the view of what people usually say about justice. And the same idea has surfaced at different periods of intellectual thought. But what I was concerned about in my book was modern social contract theory, which is the social contract theory that was written after 1950. And I survey that range of thought within that broad tradition.
So many people who haven't heard of the term social contract theory, I suspect will be thinking, this sounds a bit familiar to me. Many listeners may have come across John Rawls, come across the idea of decision-making behind the veil of ignorance, that kind of thing. Is that what we're talking about here?
We are talking about that, but there are, I suppose, three main variants of social contract theory. John Rawls has been overwhelmingly important in defining one way of thinking about social contract theory. And that way is to say, well, when we're thinking about this constitutional moment, we're actually thinking about people who don't know their own future place in society. They don't know what the colour of the skin is going to be. They don't know whether they're going to be male or female. They don't know whether they're going to be old or young. They don't know whether they're going to be rich or poor or whatever. They're behind this veil of ignorance. And that veil of ignorance, so to speak, provides them with the motive to try and agree principles of justice. Other social contract theorists dispense with that veil of ignorance. They say, actually, no, what's really required when you're thinking about the terms to govern your association together is that you try and come up with justifications of principles that are mutually acceptable, that are mutually agreeable. A third way of thinking about it, and this is very much the view that I've tried to develop over the years, is that what's really essential is that people are conducting this negotiation under a rough equality of balance of power. And that rough equality of balance of power, if you like, is the counterpart to the veil of ignorance. It's what takes away the partiality, the partisanship, if you like, when people are thinking about these terms of association.
But presumably we don't live in a setting of roughly balanced power. So you're imagining a hypothetical choice situation there.
Yes. So this is very important indeed. So in a way, there are lots of social contracts all over the place. Once you start thinking in this way, you can see social contracts. So take something very simple like queuing. The principle of first come, first serve. It's a very common practice that we have. And we have to think about, why do we have that practice? Well, it's a convention, but not all conventions that we have are justifiable. So at one time, for example, there was a convention that rich people got into higher education and poor people didn't. That was a convention of the society, but we wouldn't say that was a just convention. So the real question is, what is it that makes the difference between these social contracts, these practices, these normative commitments that we have that are just on the one side and those that are unjust on the other, or relatively unjust on the other? And the thought of social contract theorists has got to be that there's some criterion, some test that you apply to those potential agreements that distinguishes between the just and the unjust. So Rawls's answer, and people who think like Rawls say, well, you can know it's just because actually it's what people would agree if they didn't know what their own future situation was. Other people would say, well, you can see it's just because actually that's what people with equal power or roughly equal power could agree with one another. In other words, there's no built-in advantage. There's no bias to one side or the other.
And how do we know what people would agree in that situation? I mean, in either the situation that you're describing or the Rawlsian situation behind the veil of ignorance, we're not there, and we never have been there. And given the nature of our lives, we can't possibly be there. So how can we know how we would decide there?
You're absolutely right. Although I'm just going to cavil at your last claim that we couldn't possibly know. But as you pointed out, this is a very long book, and a large part of it is taken up with precisely that question: how is it that we could know what people would decide? Now, one of the reasons why that the modern social contract theory is interesting is that it thought it had an unambiguously clear answer to that question. And the reason why it thought it had an unambiguously clear answer to that question is as follows. As well as people being located in a constitutional moment, it was assumed that these people were rational. They were reasoning, thinking individuals who, for example, could pursue their own interests in a prudent and sensible way. And in the mid-20th century, there developed in philosophy and in economics a particular theory of rationality. And there was a theory of rationality which basically said to be rational was to be a person who maximized their expected utility, who tried to maximize the sum of advantages in their future life. And this was a very, very well-developed theory. It was a theory that drew upon some quite rich and complicated logic and axiomatic mathematics. And it was a very powerful vision about what it meant to be rational. And so the idea was that if you knew and understood what it meant to be rational, and you could place these rational individuals in a situation in which they didn't know, for example, who they were going to be, then those rational individuals would converge on a set of principles by virtue of their rationality and lack of partiality. Now, the problem is that there are lots of difficulties with that underlying theory of rationality. I won't go into the details now. I mean, there's a whole chapters are written in this book about why this is problematic. But I'll just give you one example about why it might be problematic, which is this theory of rationality has one implication which runs as follows. It says, suppose you were thinking about a future society, and suppose that in that future society, some people were better off than others, actually considerably better off than others, but in a way that didn't disadvantage you. You were no poorer as a result of their being better off. So the theory of rationality says we shouldn't care about that. You shouldn't care about that at all. You should just be focused on your own stream of advantages. Now, there are quite good reasons why you might want to care about that. One of the reasons you might want to care is that behind this veil of ignorance, you might think, well, I'm concerned as much about the dispersion of opportunity in society as I am about what I'm going to get out of it. And there's an extensive criticism actually within the decision theoretic literature of this normally standard approach. And these days, there's a whole school, in fact, many schools of people who contest the expected utility theory. So that leaves you with the question of how would you know? So one thought is, well, we ask people to be reasonable. And what being reasonable means is that they only put forward arguments that they have reason to think that other people have reason to accept. Again, I think that's an interesting way of thinking. I think it's one of the ways of thinking, for example, that lies behind a lot of the developments in deliberative democracy in recent years in political theory, democratic theory. But I think it suffers the obvious problem, which is that people can be reasonable and can still disagree. And if you want a theory that says that principles emerge out of agreement among reasonable people and people can still disagree, then that's not going to get you very far. My own view, which in fact I tried, this present book is a sort of prequel to a book I published 7 years ago, where I tried to develop a different answer to that question, which actually took up one theme in modern social contract theory, which goes back to Brian Barry. And Brian Barry had the thought that, well, we could know what people would agree to under certain circumstances, empirical circumstances in which we can observe in the real world, where there is a rough balance of power. And I explored various situations. I was particularly interested in Elinor Ostrom's view of common property resource regimes, which are situations of balance of power, so to speak, where people are roughly equal in their advantages. And Elinor Ostrom looked at the way in which things like water resources were managed or grazing resources were managed. And interestingly, you do find in very different cultures certain principles emerging in those circumstances that do seem successfully to govern the terms of association. I mean, interestingly, one of those principles is something like queuing, taking it in turns. That's not surprising if you think about it, because in a situation in which people have got a rough equality of power, then one natural convention that you might converge on is this thought, well, we all have a go at a roughly equal level.
So I'm intrigued by that, because it sounds like you're saying that we take as our guide to what we should decide collectively, essentially what we have decided collectively in certain circumstances. So you need to be very confident, I guess, that the circumstances that you're drawing that from really do have this balanced power feature.
Yes, indeed. And you have also to be confident about something else. And there's a philosophical dimension to social contract theory that is relevant at this point, and that runs as follows. Social contract theorists were interested in this question about how would we formulate these principles, because they mistrusted intuitions. They mistrusted the thought that people know what the right thing is to do. In this sense, actually, they resemble very much the utilitarians of the 19th century, also mistrusted that thought. People in the 19th century knew that women shouldn't have the vote, and the utilitarians were skeptical of that. And social contract theorists pick up that skepticism about, well, what you might call the intuitions in one mode, and what you might call the prejudices in another mode that people have about what's right and wrong. Now, there is a strand in social contract theory which says let's eliminate intuitions completely. Let's go down to rock bottom and just think about hard-nosed, rational individuals who have no sense of right and wrong. The only thing is that they're placed in certain circumstances. Can they agree? And I spent a lot of time interrogating that view in the book, and I come to the conclusion that in the end, you do need some intuitions. You need some intuition about what is a roughly fair balance of advantage between people as a sort of starting point. It can be very thin, can be very restricted. It doesn't give you very strong principles of justice, but you've got to have some sense about what constitutes an impartial situation, and what constitutes an impartial situation is something like a balance of power. I don't think that's a particularly unusual thought in a way. I mean, I think that the notion that person A is likely to treat person B more fairly if person B can successfully retaliate against any wrong that person A does to person B. I don't think that seems to me to be quite a natural thought, but there is a certain sort of intuition there.
But would it be fair for me to suppose that many of the societies that we find in which there is reasonably balanced power, from which you're suggesting we can learn usefully, are deeply patriarchal societies in which, therefore, many people would question that we can validly build anything upon them?
So this touches on another theme of the book, and there is a very, very interesting feminist critique of social contract theory, which I discuss. And interestingly, feminists take two views about social contract theory. One strand of feminist criticism says, look, this is just the wrong way to think about human relationships. Thinking about human relationships as though they were a contract to mutual advantage neglects all sorts of ethically relevant emotions of caring, of generosity, and so on. And a social contract theory is a sort of masculinist view of the world. The other school, that I won't surprise you to know, this is the school to which I'm sympathetic, says, look, of course patriarchy has governed, but we understand what's wrong with patriarchy once we see that women would not have voluntarily agreed to these conditions. Takes up, if you like, John Stuart Mill's theme in The Subjection of Women, that what you see in patriarchal societies is the imposition of power by one group upon another. So it's not, so to speak, that the existing social contract is just. It's not just, and we know it's not just because it contains this imbalance of power. And so social contract theory becomes a way of trying to articulate how dependency itself can make people vulnerable to injustice. So there are two views here. I've tried in the book to present them as fairly as I can. I come down, unsurprisingly, on one side rather than the other. But there are these two views.
So we're discussing these deep theoretical concepts here. Let's try to help out our listeners by going a bit more concrete. Can you give us a concrete case in which applying the principles of social contract theory might help us to come to an understanding of what we should do?
Well, how many do you want, really? So let me start with with an obvious one. So the present government tells us that it's got a levelling up agenda. It tells us that various parts of the country, England, north of England, have been neglected, have been relatively deprived over the last decades or so, and it's the task of the government to help level up that situation. Entirely praiseworthy view, in my opinion. However, that leaves you with a dilemma. What if you can't level up without leveling down? Lots of people say, sometimes I think in a rather pompous way, oh, well, leveling up's okay, but we must never level down. We must never take things away from those who are well off in order to help those who are less well off. Well, suppose that option is not available. Suppose that to some degree at least, you can only level up insofar as you level down, insofar as you raise taxes on the better off in order to provide benefits for the less well off. Economic training, for example. Now, social contract theory helps you think about that question systematically. The sort of dominant view in social contract theory says that, well, you are entitled to level down, if I can put it that way, to the point at which when you're leveling down, you're not making the least well off any worse off than they currently are. In other words, if there are genuine incentive effects in society, that we need to pay the talented and the more productive a bit more in order to raise everybody's standards, rising tide lifts all boats type of argument, then that's okay. In fact, actually, the view, and I was talking about the criticism of modern utility theory earlier. In fact, I take up that criticism and suggest actually that in a contractual situation, people might attach value to the simple fact of equality itself, or at least greater equalization. And that would imply, actually, and some people find this paradoxical, but that would imply that a society which was more equal in some regards, but less well off in material terms, might be a better society than one which was in aggregate terms better off, but it was in aggregate terms better off at the price of greater equality. So I think social contract theory sort of really forces us to think through these questions and pose these questions to ourselves.
So I can see that it helps us think them through. Does it actually give us an answer that we can be confident is right? I'm just thinking about Rawls, for example, again. So Rawls famously came up with the maximin principle in this context, that we should maximize the welfare of the person who has the least, essentially. How do we know that version is correct, not some other version, a slightly different principle?
So the honest answer to that question is that we don't know that version is correct, and indeed, I believe it to be the wrong answer. And what social contract theory will not do is it won't give you a technical manual that you can look up and you can say, well, what's the right thing to do in these circumstances? What it does is it provides a framework of thinking, which, if it's addressed in a disciplined way, helps you think what the feasible answers might be, what the justifiable answers might be. It doesn't say there's only one answer. There might be several reasonable answers. Just as we might say that there are several different reasonable ways of organizing a democracy. There's not just one right way of organizing a democracy. Similarly, there might be several different ways of thinking about the tax benefit system or thinking about the devolution of power, or whatever it might be. Social contract theory, I think, does rule out some answers. So it might tell us what's not a good answer, even if it can't tell us what is the single best right answer. So there's this critique of meritocracy going around at present, which says that the trouble with modern societies is that they've claimed to be meritocratic. And what that's come down to is that those who do well in the economic race can put it down to their own merits, and they can say, I deserve this very high income. Well, I think social contract theory would find that a very implausible answer. It would find it very implausible to say, to connect, so to speak, somebody's effort via a notion of desert with their economic reward. And that's because essentially society is a cooperative enterprise, and it becomes very difficult to factor out, so to speak, the individual contribution from the collective context in which that occurs.
Okay, so you're making an appealing case for social contract theory here. What are the key rivals to social contract theory? What are the alternative theories that we should be aware of?
Okay, so I suppose the first rival is the one that I mentioned a few minutes ago, which is intuitionism of some kind. I mean, some people say, look, we just know what the right thing to do is, and there's clearly some truth in that. I mean, there's clearly some truth in the thought that when some spectacular injustice is committed, I mean, people are maltreated, they're treated differently according to their ethnic group, by the law, by the police forces, and so on. I mean, one can intuitively recognize there's an injustice there. But I think it doesn't really address the question about the controversial cases, the difficult cases. Nor, I think, does it really address the question about what you might think of as, I'll use this term, it's a controversial term to use, but what you might think of as moral progress. So at one time, it was a common assumption of the law that rape was impossible within marriage. I think social contract theory shows you why that's not a plausible assumption. It's not an arrangement that people would contract to. Now, that insight, of course, is not unique to social contract theory. The utilitarians had something like the same thought. And I suppose, and in a way, my sparring partners in this book, the ones that I really have to take seriously, is the utilitarian tradition. I mean, the tradition that underlies, for example, non-sectarian education at UCL, to mention just one instance. So the utilitarians had the view that we couldn't know intuitively what the right thing to do is, but we could try and systematize our judgment about what the right thing to do is by saying, well, what is it that maximizes overall happiness, the greatest happiness of the greatest number? And at the time at which that principle was articulated, that seemed a great reforming principle, because it said that Well, happiness was happiness. It didn't matter whose happiness it was. In fact, actually, the utilitarians were even prepared to apply that principle to sentient, non-human animals. It didn't matter whose happiness it was. It just mattered that happiness was created. And as that doctrine developed in the 19th and early 20th centuries, I think it was a reforming doctrine, and it was also a doctrine that had great intellectual power. In fact, John Rawls, whom we've mentioned more than once, and if you like, sees utilitarianism as his target, says at one point, utilitarianism displays the highest intellectual level of achievement of any social doctrine in the modern period. So it's a doctrine you've got to respect. And the reason why you've got to respect it is that they took this claim about trying to justify principles very seriously. The difficulty, I think, with utilitarianism, many difficulties with utilitarianism. How do you compare pleasures and pain? For example, how can you know what's going on inside the sort of happiness of somebody else's head? But the biggest difficulty, and this is where I think many social contract theorists have come in, is it doesn't take into account distribution. It says what really matters is the total sum of happiness, total sum of net happiness. That's what's really important. It doesn't say, well, is there a minimum level of well-being or happiness that everybody should have? Because theoretically, you could, so to speak, advantage the majority at the cost of the unhappiness of a minority. It doesn't take seriously the claim that each of us as a person has certain minimum entitlements that ought to be guaranteed in any society. John Stuart Mill, great utilitarian thinker, was well aware of this. He spoke about the groundwork of our existence and the need to guarantee the groundwork of our existence. But I think that I follow here the social contract tradition in thinking that you don't have a suitable social philosophy that guarantees the groundwork of existence unless that social philosophy can meet the test that this is something to which everybody, under suitable circumstances, could agree.
We have time for just one final question, I'm afraid. So supposing we do all agree that social contract theory is the right way forward, how should social contract theory be developing now? Is it now a kind of dead theory? In the sense that we've got it and we just need to apply it? Or do scholars such as yourself still have a lot of work to do in refining it further?
Well, I hope it's not. I hope it's still a living tradition, a living way of thinking, rather than something that we can just sort of store on the bookshelves and say that's it. And the reason I think that is that I think it's particularly well adapted to a democratic society. I think social contract theory is particularly well adapted to a society in which different individuals, and probably more particularly different social groups, have to find ways of forming an association with one another that is durable, that is acceptable, that is legitimate, and so on. And asking the question, if they negotiate, try and form a contract with one another, by what principles could they agree to live, I think is a very good way of addressing that. And one of the virtues, I think, of social contract theory, which we haven't had time to speak about, but is that it can be applied to agents at all sorts of levels of aggregation. So we can think about this social contract theory, for example, in terms of the contracts, the international treaties that states can form with one another. So take the much vexed question of sovereignty. The argument that international organizations like the European Union intrude upon sovereignty, and in intruding upon sovereignty, they, so to speak, undermine the democratic credentials of a society. Now, one of the things that social contract theory teaches you is that you cannot successfully form a social contract with any other group of people unless you can be credible in the commitments that you make to those people. They're not going to rely on you to do something in return for them holding back or doing something for you, unless you can make a credible commitment that is what you're really going to do. That the commitment's got to be credible. And what we see in international organizations is ways in which countries require credible commitments to one another. I think that grows just directly out of the logic of social contract theory. So if you want to be a good contractual citizen, don't go around breaking your promises. I think that's a message that's going to continue for some time.
That's a wonderfully apposite thought on which to conclude in this particular week. Thank you so much, Albert. This has been fascinating. I think we could have gone on for a very long time, but I hope we have at least whetted our listeners' appetites. If so, you will find the book in all good bookshops and online. It's called Modern Social Contract Theory by Albert Weale, and it's published by Oxford University Press. Next week, we have our final episode of 2020 and our final episode before the United Kingdom leaves the mechanisms of the European Union. At the time we're recording this, on Tuesday, the 8th of December, we still don't know whether there will be a trade deal between the UK and the EU. Perhaps we will know by next week, perhaps we won't. But either way, we will be gathering our very own team of European politics experts to chew over the state of play. How does Brexit look from across the Channel, and what should we expect in the months and years ahead? I hope you'll join us for that. Remember to make sure you don't miss out on future episodes of UCL Uncovering Politics. All you need to do is subscribe. You can do so on Apple, Spotify, or whatever podcast provider you use. I'm Alan Rennick. Our producer is Abby Turner. Our theme music is written and performed by John Mann. This has been UCL Uncovering Politics. Thank you for listening.